Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Decouple Podcast, where we explore the science and technologies that can decouple human well-being from its ecological impacts, and the politics that can make decoupling possible. Welcome back to Decouple. Today I'm joined by returning guest, Isabelle Boemeke. Isabelle is a nuclear energy influencer and fashion model. She grew up in a small town in Brazil and experienced energy scarcity, which made her passionate about addressing energy inequality. Boemeke, through her character Isodope, uses her social media channels to educate the public on the benefits of nuclear energy.
This is Diablo Canyon, California's last nuclear power plant. For 35 years, it has created clean electricity for 3 million people. It could continue doing that for another 20 years, but the plant is being forced to shut down early. But why the hell should you care about any of this? Well, climate change is here. We have all seen the orange skies, the insane heat and fires. There is no time to waste. We have to decarbonize now. You have learned from my makeup tutorial.
Her videos, which use current pop culture trends and meme language, have gone viral and been shared by prominent nuclear engineers and physicists. She's changing the face of science communication and is now one of the few science communicators with a mostly female audience on TikTok at over 80%. Isabelle, welcome back to Decouple.
Well, it's a pleasure to be back here.
You know, I do kind of pride myself on sometimes getting the breaking news. I forget what's the term in the news cycle where you catch the story as it first comes out. But I think you might have been my first podcast interview. I might have kind of caught you on the upswing. My friend John Alberg was like, "You got to talk to this Isodope person on your podcast." So,
I didn't know it was a recommendation. I thought you had come across my content.
I think I had, but John sort of gave me the little kick in the pants, and I'm ever so glad that I did. And it's been really cute because some people that have gone on to interview have sort of reached out and thanked me for having you on initially. So anyway, enough kind of self-referential stuff about me, but it's been great having you on in the past. I look forward very much to this episode. And just a great chance to kind of catch up because it's been just about a year since we last talked. And I think you were towards the beginning of your science communication journey at that point. So how has your year been?
Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, the time we spoke, I had maybe released 2 or 3 videos.
Yeah.
Which was right at the beginning. But thankfully, even from that early stage, even with my first video, I got really good traction. People shared the videos a lot. And of course, my follower numbers grew a lot over this past year because of, the unusual videos, I would say. Mm-hmm. And it's been really interesting just to kind of see how public perception is changing a little bit towards nuclear. And of course, that's not because of my work at all. It's because of the work of a lot of people over decades. But it has been very rewarding to see, the language around climate change starting to be a little bit more inclusive of nuclear energy. Of course, this week we saw a letter signed by hundreds of environmental organizations asking that nuclear be excluded. Mm-hmm. But I think even that letter itself got a lot of pushback from people in the energy community and people in the climate community. Mm-hmm. So it's been super rewarding, and I have so much fun doing all the videos. They're, pretty out there, and I think a lot of people don't get them. A lot of people are a little freaked out or weirded out by them, and even that in itself is fun.
Yeah,
it's entertaining.
It kind of fuels the mystique, I feel, for sure. I mean, we are at a very interesting moment. I agree with you in terms of that open letter that was just sent out. Also seeing environmental organizations like the NRDC, I'll call it dancing on the grave of Indian Point, where New York lost more clean energy in a morning than all of its combined wind and solar fleet. And I think that kind of hypocrisy is hopefully starting to become apparent, or just it's hard to hide from that again as the urgency of climate change increases and as more light is being shone on it. And I think you're being quite modest in terms of your impact there. But let's talk about that impact, the conversations that you're having. Obviously, you're speaking to a lot of people on energy Twitter. But like, who else are you interacting with? Like, maybe give us an example of some people that you've been speaking to from different communities, and how your content and how you are being received.
The interesting thing about my platform is that on each individual social media platform, I have a completely different audience. So on Twitter, I would say it's mostly males and a lot of people who are in the science community, a lot of people who are in the energy community. But on Instagram, I have a lot of female models that follow me, but just because of my profession. So these are people who generally don't think about electricity or energy. You know, most of them are concerned about climate change, and so they pay attention to what I have to say due to that concern, but they never really thought about what it would take and all the technological changes that's necessary to, you know, mitigate the worst effects of climate change. And then on TikTok, it's a completely different audience from both the other platforms, in that it's mostly 14 to 25-year-old females. Like you said, you know, my audience is 82% 14 to 25-year-old females.
Wow.
So it's interesting to see how first of all, each of these audiences receives my message in a very different way, but also how I see them changing their minds. So on Twitter, I didn't have to do a lot of convincing, to be honest, because my audience was already skewed towards people who embrace the technology, and most people who followed me because I started posting the pro-nuclear videos.
Right.
On Instagram, people would, in the beginning, they would send me DMs asking, wait, are you for real? Like, do you actually mean that nuclear energy is clean? Like, people called me, people would FaceTime me asking, but wait, how do you know this? And, you know, this is so different from what we hear out there. And slowly, of course, as they started following me, they see me posting all these headlines, you know, big newspapers like the New York Times, for instance, talking about how when Indian Point shut down, the first reactor was shut down, it was mostly replaced by natural gas, and how with the second reactor shut down, it will probably also be replaced by natural gas. So people are slowly starting to see that I'm not totally insane.
Right. Right.
And that, you know, I was onto something. And they DM me and say that I totally changed their perception. And then on TikTok, people are mostly just blown away
Yeah.
because they're so young and they don't know much. And, you know, of course, the little they know is negative, but they're mostly just surprised, like, oh my God, I didn't know that, you know, nuclear was, you know, 20% of the US's electricity, or that nuclear waste, you know, looks like boring dry casks just sitting somewhere.
A bunch of pop
And
cans.
right, a bunch of cans, and that we have a technical solution to the problem. So it's super rewarding. And as you know, and anybody who follows me, I interact a lot with my audience, just because I actually enjoy talking to them and learning from them, and even having healthy debates.
I think it's so interesting. You've said in the past that you kind of nerded out on evolutionary psychology for a while, and it's something that I think about a fair amount in terms of this, you know, for lack of a better word, sort of tribal thinking and tribal allegiances that we have, just kind of growing up in whatever microculture you grow up in, or whatever scene that you're based out of. You tend to have a series of beliefs that just kind of feel natural to you, and that are kind of affirmed by your tribe and the kind of leadership of the tribe, the influencers, if you will. And you know, that's a lot of these kind of compelling stories of these science-based environmentalists who sort of question their previous assumptions about nuclear energy. A lot of that is kind of that engaging in that process, and sort of fear of being exiled from your tribe or being judged. Like, these are very real evolutionary fears. You know, our ancestors' survival was very much related to sort of you know, not being exiled, shall we say. And I think, you know, your role as an influencer is very interesting, because, you know, for those 18 to 24-year-old or 14 to 24-year-old women audience, and your audience in general, it just signals that there's another way to look at this issue. And I think that's why a lot of people's heads kind of do this 360 spin when they come across your content.
Right. And it's also because the younger generations, they don't have, their identity is not so tied to nuclear as someone who is, you know, 60 or 70 years old. I feel like their perception of themselves is much more connected to that sentiment of anti-nuclear. And as we know, stems basically from anti-nuclear weapons, which, by the
Mhm.
way, I'm against nuclear weapons as well. And like, to me, they're, the physics might be the same in that you're fissioning atoms to get energy, but the end goal is completely different. And it's just another example of a technology that has the potential for great good and terrible evil.
Mhm.
And we as humans have to choose, to use it for good. Another technology being AI, for example. And, in my opinion, we shouldn't just be rallying to completely shut down these technologies. We have to create safeguards and protocols around to make sure it's used for good purposes.
Mhm. So, Isabelle, something that I think is really interesting about your aesthetic and your persona is this optimism and positivity about humans and humanity, and it's something that I think is really lacking in this. I don't know, in this moment we're living in, where I see a lot of youth, mostly in the developed world, who have a really negative opinion of humanity and a real dark vision of sort of what we're heading towards. And it's, I think Greta Thunberg is probably a part of that and shapes that to some degree. And like, no disrespect on her for that in particular. I mean, these are difficult times, and if you're wrestling with questions of climate change and you're recognizing that it's a very serious issue and it's going to have a big impact on your future, it's understandable. But I do really worry about the mental health of this, generation that's coming up, with the kind of messaging that they're getting. So tell me a little bit more about that part of you, that positivity. I think it has something to do with space. That's one of the sources of your like humans are awesome instinct.
Yeah, well, it has a lot of, it's a lot of references to Carl Sagan, who we talked about on our first interview, who is one of my idols. And yes, space in a way, but not so much space, more the cosmic perspective of the universe. And and a lot is due to David Deutsch, who I think I also talked about in our first interview. And he's this theoretical physicist out of Oxford. And he wrote a book called The Beginning of Infinity, in which he lays out the case that humans are indeed special, and not because, we have a soul or anything esoteric and mysterious about us, but because we can effectively change the universe around us through the creation of knowledge. So, we observe the universe, we understand how it works, and because we understand how it works, we can create technologies to improve upon it. And the reach of these technologies are basically limitless, right? We can keep making the world better and improving on existing technologies forever, as long as they're within the laws of physics. So that book and that view really, really shaped how I see the world. I could say honestly, before reading that book, which was maybe like 5 years ago, I can't even remember, but I used to be a little bit of a negative person myself. I used to think, there is no meaning to life, and we're kind of just here, and we're going to die, and we're kind of destroying the planet. I, for the longest time, did not want to have kids, because of, I was afraid of bringing people into the world because of climate change and overpopulation concerns. And that book alone totally changed how I see the world. And I think, a lot of this position is because this movement is largely led by very young people who maybe will change their minds once they get older. And I think for me, getting older, one of the things I realized is that the things that we humans care about are other humans. The things that we care about are our friends and our partners and the people we love and care about. So this idea that, we're saving the environment, who are we saving the environment for? We're saving the environment so people can enjoy it, so people can enjoy it with the people they love. And of course, there's a balance, right? We can't just say, oh, humans are the only thing that matters, and screw all other animals. Of course not. We should strive for a balance in which humans are flourishing without killing other species, and without preventing other species from flourishing as well.
Yeah, and I mean, I think a big part of why we are driven to preserve the biodiversity and have an like aesthetic appreciation for, untouched wilderness, I mean, that's kind of a human value as well. So it does sort of come back to that.
Right.
And I think getting back to that sort of the kind of doomerism of this generation. I mean, I certainly remember before I started to look at, what's the scale of the problem we're dealing with. First, you learn about that when you look at climate change, and it's very natural to become a doomer. But then, like, once you start looking at potential solutions, and not just the solutions, but the kind of I don't know, like it's I don't want to say ideology, but there's a group of people, and I don't know what to refer to them as or what to refer to myself as, but eco-modernists might be one, pragmatic environmentalists might be another way to look at it. I'm always very avoidant of labeling myself in any such way, but it's exciting to come across a community that is, can combine that passion that I had for human rights with the passion that I have for the environment, and try and track a vision that can honor those two values. So right. I don't know.
And we can have that, values for other life as well. I mean, you don't have to choose one. I think that's the point you're trying to make, is that we can do all of it, or strive to do all of it. And the other thing, I mean, and I go back to Deutsch just because his book was probably one of the most important things, I've come across. And in the book, he also talks about how problems are inevitable, but solvable. And it's all a matter of acquiring the necessary knowledge in time. Mm-hmm. So with this, in the case of climate change, yes, it is. The weird thing about climate change is that it's straightforward in what needs to happen, right? It's not like we're lacking information on what we need to do, mm-hmm. but actually accomplishing it is, a massive undertaking that will take a level of global cooperation probably never seen before, right?
Absolutely.
Energy touches every single thing that we do in every single country. So
I think there's
a long road ahead for sure.
There's that quote, and I remember looking at this on the anniversary of the Apollo missions. I was never a space geek as a kid. I was always like, we need to fix the planet. What are we doing, wasting all these resources going into space? And I've kind of shifted my thinking somewhat. I'm still a bit of a stick in the mud, but the optimism of what we can achieve. I think you talk not only about the Apollo mission, but a probe that was sent to land on a comet, I think. Yeah. But nonetheless, like, how amazing that is. But with climate change, it's like, we don't need to just get, a person on the moon. It's kind of like we need to move all of humanity onto the moon. Like, it's that scale of a challenge. It's I oscillate between fascination with, the possibilities and the ways that we can go about solving it, frustration with, the politics of the day, pessimism, just like when you start to look at the size of the mountain you're trying to scale, but something just keeps me going. Let's shift gears a little bit. And, again, you talked about this very large 80% young woman audience. I'm more familiar with the nuclear Twitter side of things, or Twitter side of things. I'm not really on TikTok. I finally tracked down your TikTok channel and watched a bunch of your stuff in preparation for this. Feeling like, definitely feeling like my generation right now. But tell me about your own perspective on engaging with women in this space.
I mean, the way I go about it is that I try to do everything differently from what has been done in the past in terms of science communication. And that starts with the aesthetic, which is very important to me. And I think it's very important to a lot of women. And the other thing is on the language itself, of trying to be understanding, because it's so tempting to just start spilling out the facts, mm-hmm. because we're all, one of the reasons why we all were convinced by nuclear power is because we kind of go with the facts. But most of these arguments against nuclear, they're not really coming out of facts. They're coming out of concerns and fears around a kind of new technology. Although nuclear has been around now for a while, people are usually wary of new technologies and things they don't understand. And nuclear is one of those that is it's very hard to understand. Just even understanding how you can get to make electricity from a nuclear power plant is hard. Whereas if you compare with solar, it's pretty straightforward, right? Of course, solar panels are complex and all of that, but you can kind of see the sun, and you know that the sun is hot, and you can kind of understand that the panels are just capturing the energy from the sun. Mm-hmm. I think one thing that I noticed a lot of people do is, because it's tempting as well, because it becomes a tribalistic issue, right? To just defend your side, is to totally downplay any and every concern that's raised around nuclear. And it could be safety, or it could be environmental justice concerns. You know, one of the big ones that I can think of right now, just because it's on my mind, is the concerns around uranium mining in Navajo Nation. And I don't think we talked about this in our first
No, I don't think so.
But you might know this, and a lot of people who listen to your podcast might know this. There are currently hundreds of abandoned uranium mines in Navajo Nation in the United States. And some of these mines have, leached into the water supply, and people have drank contaminated water. They built homes with radioactive rocks, and it has damaged people's health and their lives. And a lot of nuclear power advocates just want to insist that it was something caused by the nuclear weapons industry. But it's hard to disentangle this history everywhere, but especially in the United States. And even if nuclear energy per se wasn't the driver of that increase in uranium mining, it also benefited from it. It also used some of the uranium that was mined from there. So this is a perfect example of nuclear energy advocates just totally shutting down any of these concerns. And I think it turns people off. They just think you're not engaging in good faith, and you're just trying to protect the industry.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I think social media just lends itself really well to escalation, the assumption of the worst about the person that you might be disagreeing with. Let's shift gears a little bit. Actually, sorry, one more thing I did want to ask you is, in my experience of engaging with nuclear advocates around the world, I've really had the privilege of getting to know a lot of people through this podcast, and it's been very international, from the Philippines to Poland just earlier this week, a whole variety of countries, and I'm looking forward to getting some African voices on the podcast as well. But the advocates that I run into are really the most grassroots people you can imagine, operating on absolute shoestring budgets, self-funded, or little crowdsourcing, a few bucks here and there from their friends or other people that are committed. I think of other groups like Mothers for Nuclear, for instance, where there's such a assumption by the broader society that you've got to be working for the industry, right? I think maybe because there's this perception that nuclear is just really evil, and who would do this, who would put their effort into this without being compelled to by some dark force. I'm sure that you run into that, at least that question, if not that accusation. So tell me a little bit about what that's been like.
Yeah, I mean, every day there is someone accusing me of working for the nuclear industry. Somebody actually made a blog post recently talking about how the nuclear industry is going so low. They've hired people like me and Xeon to allure to young women. It was
wow.
It was funny and interesting. I don't even take those accusations seriously.
Mm-hmm.
If anything, just receiving those accusations has made me be very hesitant about accusing other people of being corrupt.
Interesting. Yeah.
I noticed how that is when people don't have any arguments, that's the first thing they'll say. They'll say, "Oh, you're being paid to say so."
Yeah.
And so now, whenever somebody's even around all these plant closures in the United States, there, as you know, there are a lot of theories going around that it's because these governments are corrupt or certain organizations are corrupt. And I think, well, it could be, but let's go through the list of other things that are possibly true instead of jumping straight into the corruption accusations, because I think it's counterproductive and it could just be wrong.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So it has made me wiser, I guess.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's certainly documented evidence, not recent, but I think within the last 10 years of groups like NRDC taking fossil fuel money from natural gas, when natural gas was much more framed as this, magical transition fuel that was going to get us to this decarbonized future. And now I think,
I think Sierra Club as well took a very big donation from natural gas.
Yeah,
and it was something that was leaked years after.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. So, Isabelle, you've made a really interesting decision in terms of where to focus your advocacy. And it's a decision that I respect a lot, but I understand it wasn't always the easiest thing in the world. And a lot of people said, why are you wasting your time trying to save Diablo Canyon? So
everybody tried to tell me not to waste my time.
Yeah. So why did you choose to dedicate yourself or make this a kind of focal point of your activism?
I mean, obviously, because Diablo is the most beautiful plant in the entire world. No, that's not the reason at all. Well, because, I mean, of course, I'm passionate about saving every single nuclear power plant, but that, should be saved and extended. But it is not actually feasible. I myself couldn't help save every single nuclear power plant. So a better approach would be to focus on saving one. Mm-hmm. And especially because I'm not doing policy work, which, maybe could have a bigger impact in terms of saving all existing plants. I'm doing more public communications and advocacy work. So focusing on one, I think, is helpful, not only for me, but also for the people who follow me to follow the story and what's happening with the plant and how they can be helpful. And the reason why I chose Diablo was because, well, I'm in California, so is Diablo. Diablo is actually California's last nuclear power plant. And because it seems to be it's probably the most controversial plant in the United States. I think it is the most controversial plant in the United States. And it seems to be where a lot of this, environmental movement split and fight, and just like it kind of decided the future of the environmental movement in the United States. So it's very relevant for that reason. And also because I believe that if Diablo shuts down, California will be a nuclear power free state. And I think the chances of, potentially building more nuclear power plants, which would help with decarbonization, are very low after that happens.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to just touch on what you said at the beginning about Diablo Canyon being a beautiful nuclear power plant. I mean, it is really interesting, kind of the aesthetics of energy. Like I live in Ontario. It's the France of North America. We have a lot of nuclear here, very much out of sight, out of mind, because I mean, these are big facilities. We have the largest operating nuclear generation site in the world in Ontario, on a tiny little footprint of land. But, we embarked on a Germanization where we built a lot of wind and solar. And I remember driving through the countryside and seeing a lot of huge wind turbines going up and thinking, oh, like, I don't like the aesthetic of these, but, they're what we need to, like, you can't be NIMBY about this. This is what we need to sort of save the planet and fight climate change. So, I mean, and I was interviewed on our national broadcaster a while ago, and they talked about the hulking nuclear plant that, you drive past on the highway, which incidentally, you can't actually see from the highway, and produces enough energy for, the largest city in Canada on a land footprint that's something like 1.2 square kilometers. But it is interesting as you kind of dive into this world, the aesthetics of nuclear change for you, I think, as you're kind of less fearful. And I mean, a lot of plants are kind of ugly, like they're, lots of concrete. But Diablo Canyon is situated on the California coast, like nestled in these green verdant mountains, in this, this little natural harbor looking area of seacoast. It is very interesting. I mean, I chose it for the image for the Decouple podcast, because I was like, wow, this is really gorgeous. And I think when you realize that, like, I think, is it 8 or 10% of all of California's electricity is made at that one little plant?
10%, yes.
Like you can imagine that, like, if you built 9 more of those, that's a pretty inconspicuous way to create all the power that you'd need to have carbon-free electricity for California. Like it's wild.
Right. And I mean, PG&E, when they were considering building Diablo, they were thinking back then about building 7 to 10 reactors around the state.
Wow.
And the other, I mean, just going back to how beautiful Diablo is, I think a big part of it is because it also doesn't have the huge cooling towers.
Mm-hmm.
So it takes away a little bit of the concrete. And yes, it is gorgeous. And the other thing is you can only really see the plant if you're looking from the sea. You
Right.
cannot see it. You can barely see it from the road or anywhere else.
Right. So we were talking about the history of Diablo Canyon, and it is a fascinating one. As you mentioned, there was a kind of a schism in the environmental movement that I guess overlapped quite a bit with the early stages of Diablo's planning and I think building. So let's dive into that. Catch me up a little. Give me a history lesson, Isodope.
I am obsessed with this. I had no idea. I mean, I started doing research for the podcast, and I just became obsessed with certain characters throughout history and just understanding how Diablo played such a large role. So, like I said, I'm just going to start a little bit with the history of the plant. So the journey kind of began in like 1963 when PG&E announced it had planned to increase their generating capacity over the next 10 years to meet California's growing population's energy demand. And like I said, they calculated they would need to build like 7 to 10 reactors around the state. And because nuclear plants need water for cooling, as we all know, all these reactors had to be built close to the ocean. So they had an approval for a plant in Bodega Bay, which is close to San Francisco, but at the time already faced an insane amount of public opposition. Mm-hmm. Most of that opposition being led by some members of the Sierra Club, including a guy named David Brower. Well, his name is going to come up again, so remember his name.
And this is like what year? We're talking early 1960s?
Yes, early 1960s. This was 63.
Okay. David Brower.
But the Sierra Club's board of directors chose to oppose the Bodega Bay project, not as a direct opposition to nuclear per se, but because of the site's scenic value. They just thought, it was a very valuable space and they didn't want to have it ruined by having a nuclear power plant being built there. So PG&E ended up withdrawing the application because in 1964, it was discovered that the plant would sit over the San Andreas Fault. So they started looking into other areas, and they had already bought land on Nipamo Dunes, which are these gorgeous dunes close to San Luis Obispo, which is, close to where Diablo is now. Mm-hmm. But because of their terrible experience at, dealing with conservationists at Bodega Bay, they decided to instead cooperate with them and were introduced to William Siri, who was then president of Sierra Club.
Okay.
Now, the interesting thing about him is that he was a biophysicist studying nuclear radiation. So he actually saw nuclear energy as a vital and safe technology at the time. But it's similar to, the other members of Sierra Club, he didn't want the plant to be built on the dunes. So he made an agreement that if PG&E found another site, Sierra Club would support this decision. And that's how they finally ended up getting to Diablo Canyon.
It's so interesting because I think Sierra Club back then was very much like coming out of the tradition of kind of national parks and like scenic beauty. They were a bunch of like mountain climbers.
Exactly.
It was a very different kind of, I think the environmental movement really shifted from being one that was about sort of conservation of, scenic beauty to, I think Rachel Carson's book had a lot to do with that, to more of a sort of looking at global issues and global pollution and things like that. But I think that's a fascinating point. Carry on. This is great.
Yeah, it's great. He was exactly like you said, he was like, like a mountaineer, and he was, created some parks, and all the environmental movement at the time was about conserving public spaces and like beautiful public spaces, which again goes back to, how everything we do is kind of through a human lens, because what is a beautiful public space?
Right.
But anyway, so like I said, they agreed that if PG&E found another site, they would support the decision, and they finally ended up going to Diablo Canyon. And Sierra Club's board agreed on it and, communicated their approval, but some board members weren't present during the voting process and got furious. And by the way, in doing all this research, William Siri has become my idol. I had never heard of this man, and just reading about him, I've become fascinated.
Yeah.
Whenever other members of Sierra Club brought him shady articles on contamination from nuclear reactors, Siri actually said, and I quote, he said, How many people do you suppose know even the meaning of the terms used, such as millirad, much less their physical significance?
Wow.
And then he went on to point to the flaws in the article, you know, because he was actually a scientist,
Mm-hmm.
like other, you know, some other members. So after the club's endorsement of Diablo Canyon as a space for the nuclear power plant, David Brower, that guy we talked about, said publicly he thought this was a terrible mistake. And that's when all the drama began. So Brower became super anti-nuclear, a lot of it stemming from nuclear weapons, but some of it because he was actually anti-population growth
Right.
and anti-immigration. I mean, he said publicly that he thought we should close the borders and not allow immigrants to come in out of a concern from population growth. So
I think
expanding,
up until like the late 1990s, the Sierra Club was one of the dominant anti-immigration forces in the U.S. is something I read recently.
right, and then they changed their position throughout the years because they became more progressive.
Right.
But Brower, who was at Sierra Club at the time, you know, he again became super anti-nuclear because of all of this. Some because of fear of nuclear weapons, but also because he was anti-population growth. So expanding nuclear in his mind would mean that, you know, we would be able to provide electricity to more people. And so maybe this would trigger more people coming over to the United States, or more people having kids, or I don't know what went on in his mind. So this whole drama over Diablo, and ultimately his position on nuclear power, made him leave Sierra Club and start Friends of the Earth.
Interesting.
He was the founder of Friends of the Earth. So the fascinating thing here is that even by 1973, Sierra Club was still not anti-nuclear energy, mostly because of William Seery, our champ in the story, in the history here.
Right.
He actually viewed nuclear power as a threat that demanded attention, but not unlike any other natural or man-made threat like hydropower dams or an earthquake, which I
Right.
think is a very sober point, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like he's not like, oh, I'm enamored by nuclear power, and it's like this, it's like the Jesus of energy. It's more like, yeah, it could be dangerous, we have to mitigate it, but is it worse than hydropower dams? Or
I think
so
that's yeah, it's really vital because there is no like ideal or harmless or like zero touch energy generation tool. And I think like there's kind of the attribution of natural characteristics to certain technologies that are fuelless or run based on like the sun or the wind, but you know they're built out of materials that are extracted from the ground, and the mining implications are starting to be realized. And you're seeing that anxiety from within the environmental movement with movies like Planet of the Humans and Bright
right.
Green Lies. But yeah, I love that kind of nuance and that realistic way of looking at the world of like, yes, everything has an impact. Let's
Right.
assess that and make the best choices.
Right. And just being like a scientist in that, you know, do you even understand what you're talking about when you're bringing an article about,
Right.
you know, the dangers of radiation?
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I think that the reason why Sierra Club took so long to be anti-nuclear was only because of him, because he was the president at the time.
Right.
So anyway, that
I
was,
guess
you know,
Ansel Adams was another pro-nuclear member, I think. So there were a couple, but yeah, okay. The tide's turning.
right. But it was, you could already sense there was already a lot of division within Sierra Club. Some people who followed Brower and some others who, you know, followed Siri.
And your
So
argument is that a lot of that's coming out of like a bit of an anti-humanism or maybe even a Malthusianism, or at least let's keep. I mean, you can see that argument of like, well, we don't want lots of people to bespoil these scenic, pristine, natural areas, so let's try and keep them out.
I think there is a mix of all of it. It's probably, you know, it's probably not just one thing, but it's Brower talked about it publicly, so you know
Okay.
we can assume safely that that was his motivation. But I don't know for the other members. Obviously, a lot of, you know, a lot of people at the time was also kind of a new technology,
Mm-hmm.
so people didn't know what the effects would be, and I think a lot of people were afraid of, you know, the radiation in the environment and what effect that would have. I mean, to be honest, we really only have good evidence now, and that is a reason why a lot of people are revising their views on nuclear power, is because we've had these plans for, you know, over 3 decades now, so we have a lot more evidence.
Mm-hmm.
But that was the drama, with Sierra Club and Friends of the Earth. I just thought it was super interesting, and it was like a soap opera. As I was reading it, I was like, oh my God, this is so juicy. So construction finally begins in 68. But in 73, they discovered a fault that was, miles offshore from where the reactors would be built. So again, people started getting very nervous and raising concerns. So PG&E updated the plans and added a bunch of structural supports. But at this point, people were pretty much like anti-nuclear, but especially anti-Diablo Canyon. And to be fair, some really crazy stuff happening while building the plants. Like in 81, PG&E discovered that there was only one blueprint that was used for the structural supports. So workers were supposed to have reversed the plans when they were working on the second reactor, but didn't. So they kind of built the supports incorrectly. It was super over budget, and the construction that was supposed to last less than 10 years ended up lasting 14 years. And by 81, a lot of environmental organizations had led some of the most successful anti-nuclear protests ever in the world against Diablo Canyon, including a 30,000 people protest in San Francisco.
Wow.
And a 10-day blockade at the blockade. This is where the blockade at the plant in an attempt to prevent it from opening. This blockade actually resulted in like 2,000 people being arrested, which is the largest number of arrests in the history of anti-nuclear protests.
Wow.
Yeah, it's so dramatic. Like the history of Diablo Canyon is very juicy, and that's why I think people feel very passionate about it. So despite all of the drama, the plant opened in 84, and since then it's been providing clean electricity for 3 million people. People kind of forgot about it for a little bit, but after Fukushima, concerns were raised again because of Diablo Canyon's proximity to the ocean and because it's in a kind of highly seismic area. And again, I think these concerns are valid, right? When you look at what happened in Fukushima, and you see Diablo built in a fault line close to the ocean, it's very tempting to just say, well, this looks very dangerous. Let's shut it down. What the experts have to say is that the difference between Fukushima and Diablo is that, and just to remind everyone that it wasn't the earthquake that caused the damage in Fukushima, it was actually the tsunami, because the reactors actually shut down after the earthquake as they were designed to do. But the tsunami inundated the basement and prevented the backup generators from pumping water to cool the reactor.
That was because the grid power went off, right? So
the grid power went off, and so they had to rely on backup generators to cool the system. But because the tsunami inundated the area where the generators were, the backup generators just didn't work, and so.
And like I think every single reactor in Japan shut itself down in like a matter of minutes afterwards. And it is kind of interesting because like the Texas plant that went offline during the cold snap, there was like a valve sensor. Like it seems like these plants are designed really to sort of be overly sensitive to potentially minor things and shut themselves down.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so the concern here would have to be with a tsunami, not an earthquake. And the difference between Diablo and Fukushima is that the power plant in Fukushima sat about 20 feet above sea level, whereas Diablo sits on above 85 feet above sea level. So it would be a lot harder for water to do any damage. And it's probably been one of the most studied and reinforced nuclear power plants in the US just because of these concerns.
Right.
But then, sadly, in 2016, PG&E announced a joint proposal with Friends of the Earth and the NRDC and some other labor unions and organizations to invest heavily in energy efficiency and renewable energy and storage, while at the same time phasing out nuclear. So here we are.
It's a very like similar story to Indian Point in some ways with I think the decision to retire Indian Point was made with owner Entergy as well as Riverkeeper as well as some New York political figures. And it's just interesting like that these environmental organizations get such a prominent seat at the table around these decisions. I mean, I guess they're a stakeholder, and they did organize some of the largest protests in anti-nuclear history. Yeah. So that kind of agreement, 2016, gave the plants, I think, another, what, 8 or 9 years. They're supposed to. There's 2 units at Diablo Canyon. They're supposed to close in 24 and 25. Is that right?
Exactly. So Unit 1 is supposed to close in 24 and Unit 2 in 25.
And
And
this is not because the equipment is beyond repair or the reactor vessels are cracking or it's too
um,
old. What's the rationale that's being given?
yeah, the rationale that's being given is thermal pollution.
Mhm.
And
So what is that?
what they're claiming is that the water that comes out of the reactor, the water that comes in from the ocean and then comes out, is slightly too warm and it damages fish larvae.
Mhm.
And they also claim that the filtering system also sucks larvae in, and so it's damaging the marine environment. Of course, there are ways to mitigate that. You could install a more advanced filtering system that would prevent the larvae from coming in, and you could design other solutions to lower the temperature so the water that would come out of the reactor would be cooler. And by the way, these are concerns, but if you do a deep analysis of the marine environment around the plant, it's actually thriving with life, probably mostly because people don't swim there. There's very few human presence around the plant. And so there's a lot of fish, there are a lot of fish and all other forms of aquatic life. But that is the excuse being given.
But I think it kind of speaks to that idea that there is some kind of a perfect energy source that has zero environmental impact. And like,
Right.
the Topaz Solar Farm, I think in California, they had to move a lot of desert tortoises. They
Exactly.
mow down Joshua trees. I
Mhm.
mean, it's, there's impact everywhere you go. And it's just, this is a tiny little chunk of the California coastline. And as this is also within the context of a whole number of other thermal generation facilities. I think there's a whole variety of natural gas plants along the
Right.
ocean, which I think there aren't their licenses being extended because in anticipation of Diablo shutting down, and also because they're expecting blackouts in the summer.
Yes. Yeah, some of the plants that were supposed to shut down last year were being not relicensed, but were being extended because
Mhm.
out of fears of blackouts, like you said. And the truth is, like, listen, we can raise these concerns, right? But it's all a matter of choosing what's less damaging.
Mhm.
And the truth is that we know that when nuclear power plants shut down, they are replaced by fossil fuels.
Yeah.
So what is worse? Is it worse to have the fish larvae being sucked in and having the water that comes out of the plant a little bit hotter? It's like 20 degrees warmer than the water, and because the Pacific is so large, obviously, and cold, it gets to normal temperature within a couple of meters from the plant.
Yeah.
So is that worse than having people dying from air pollution caused by burning fossil fuels?
That's it was really interesting interviewing the folks from Nuclear New York, who had been so involved in the campaign to save Indian Point. And one of the statements that they steered me towards was, I believe it was a statement made by the African American Environmentalist Association. And they were, because the rationale for closing Indian Point, or one of them, was the impact on the Hudson River and fish larvae again. And
Right.
said, for the sake of, marginally improving the survival of fish larvae. And again, they did environmental impact studies on this, and there is an impact, but it is quite small, especially compared to other impacts on the Hudson River. So in the interest of a insignificant decrease in fish larva mortality, how many Black and immigrant children are we willing to have suffer asthma attacks? I think there's
Exactly.
real trade-offs involved here, and real kind of human consequences. But I thought that was, like, we talk a lot about environmental racism and environmental justice.
Mhm.
And, in regards to the Indian Point closure, certainly, there was very, very strong environmental justice arguments to
Yes.
be made there, because, I think the same is happening in California, where they're going to be keeping a bunch of old, inefficient, polluting gas plants around, because they're shutting down Diablo. And this is all, of course, happening in the context of this very ambitious climate legislation, which is, for instance, I think, trying to move California away from using natural gas for heating or, for cooking basically to electrify everything, but you're getting rid of, the most firm, stable 10% of your grid. Like it just, one of these things that starts to spin your head.
Right. And the truth is, every governor or every person in power who's pushing for the closure of these plants, they always claim that the plants will be replaced by renewables. Renewables, energy efficiency, and storage. They always say the same thing. And the data just shows us over and over again that they're replaced by fossil fuels.
Aren't we in a climate crisis? Like, what are we? I thought we were actually trying to replace, was it fossil fuels or nuclear? Fossil fuels, right? Like,
wait, natural gas is fossil fuel? I didn't know that.
Oh my god.
Maybe they don't know. Maybe they don't know the natural gas is methane.
Oh my lord. It's so disheartening.
But not only that, I mean, and I know we disagree on renewables, and we don't have to get into that now, but if they were deploying an insane amount of renewables and batteries and it would actually be replaced, I would be fine with it, even though I think it's a waste of time because we're replacing clean energy with clean energy while we should be replacing dirty energy with clean energy. But the truth is that right now, we cannot replace, Diablo Canyon with solar panels. I mean, you can, but the problem is that every single day in California, when the sun goes down, natural gas kicks in. And so you're replacing nuclear with solar maybe during the day, but not at night. And on top of that, you have to remember that California has a electric vehicle mandate that will kick in after 2035, which will greatly increase the amount of electric vehicles on the road, which will also increase energy consumption overnight because that's when people, charge their cars.
Right. It's a real opportunity to kind of, if you had a baseload source, it's a real opportunity to stabilize demand, right?
Exactly. And you know what else happens overnight?
No, what else?
The sun is not shining.
Oh, shit.
So, we don't have solar at night. So,
I thought it's always sunny in California.
It's always sunny. No, that's Philadelphia. Okay, Chris, don't get it.
All right.
I'm confused. So I just don't understand where California is going to get all of that electricity overnight from, right? If they're shutting down Diablo, they plan on shutting down their natural gas plants, which great, but they're not building the amount of batteries necessary.
Well, what's crazy as well is, I mean, I was looking at some projections for planned nuclear closures in the States. And I mean, the fleet is aging, right? We haven't been building new nuclear power plants in decades. I should say Vogel's being built. I think there was the TVA brought one other reactor online in the early 2000s, but basically the fleet is aging. And despite, licenses being renewed and these plants, looking like they can go 80 years, maybe 100 years, the projection I saw was there would only be 8 operating nuclear plants in 2050, just at the time when, all these targets of getting net zero, I think are situated. I mean, there's a variety of timelines, but 2050 for sure is one that is kind of we better get it done by at least then. How realistic that is, I don't know, but certainly a lot less realistic if you, go from, 92 reactors right now down to 8. Just the madness of A, trying to replace baseload with intermittent sources, but B, what are we focusing on here? And I'm not sure if I think it's just a real flaw in the media that probably because nuclear has no friends in the media, that these issues are not discussed, and that kind of hypocrisy of, I used to have fairly warm and fuzzy feelings about environmental organizations and Greenpeace, but increasingly, the hypocrisy that I'm seeing, and again, what I'll call dancing on the grave of Indian Point, for instance, and on the grave of, it was 2/3 of all of New York's clean energy supply. Like there's something really wrong about that. And we have people like Greta Thunberg that are calling people out as, climate criminals. And it's just, it's hard not to see that as a climate crime or climate vandalism or whatever it is.
It makes more sense if you frame it as their goal is renewable energy. Yeah. And that's what I've come to understand. Yeah. The reason why we're not having a productive conversation is because we have completely different goals. And we're coming at this problem with decarbonization in mind. And so nuclear makes a lot of sense. And especially keeping the existing fleet makes like too much sense. There is not a single good argument against keeping existing nuclear. I can see the arguments around cost and time, even though I think they're not very strong arguments.
Mm-hmm.
But there is not one single good argument about
let me hit you with like this latest metric that came across my plate just recently, and credit where it's due. I got this off of Robert Bryce's recent conversation. I think it's with Rainer Kuhr, Kuhr. And we talk a lot about various metrics for the economics of various energy transition tools. There's levelized cost of electricity, which very problematic for a number of reasons, which we won't get into right now. But I had not heard of this idea of the carbon abatement cost. So the amount of money that you need to spend on whatever clean energy technology to avoid 1 ton of CO2 being emitted. And, Reiner's data is coming from New England, so it's not applicable everywhere. And the numbers will be skewed a little bit. Obviously, solar is not as good in New England as it is in California or in Australia. But for New England anyway, the cost to avert 1 ton of CO2 with rooftop solar, which is all the rage, right? Because with rooftop solar, you get around a lot of the land use issues and the cutting down of Joshua trees and the digging up of turtles and things like that. $800 a ton. Utility wind and solar, about $300 a ton. Keeping existing nuclear open in the States, $25 a ton. Right. And if because the whole thing is that we don't, from strictly speaking, from a keeping the lights on, keeping the washing machine going perspective, we don't need any more generation, really. We need to replace some retiring plants. Right. But the whole motivation behind the energy transition is trying to retire a bunch of fossil stuff and replace it. And the rationale is not necessarily energy, it's decarbonization. So that is the fundamental metric, or one would think would be the most fundamental metric, and why, for me, closing these plants is such a climate crime. Because, it's 40 times cheaper to keep an existing nuclear plant open than to install new rooftop solar. And we have these plants which are kind of like, it's funny language. When I first heard of a nuclear power plant being compared to like a cathedral, I was like, oh, come on, you're standing way too hard here. But you're like, this is a piece of energy infrastructure that like outlives the people that built it, that provides employment that is intergenerational. Like, you just don't see that anymore. That used to happen with like, I don't know, Ford's automotive plants would be intergenerational employment, but it's a really wild phenomenon. So that metric I'm just kind of in love with, and I'm going to be doing another show on that really soon. But
yeah, but one interesting thing about that letter that came out this week about, how the government should push for 100% renewables by 2030. They make this like claim that nuclear is a false solution, which is something that I've heard before.
Right.
But then later in the document, they actually exclude existing nuclear from, like, they make a difference between existing nuclear from new nuclear. So they're basically only against new nuclear. But what I would like to see is these groups actually getting together and helping save these plants, because that would be game changing. And it seems like they have at least acknowledged recently that the existing fleet has to remain open for us to meet our targets.
I think you're referring to the Union of Concerned Scientists in particular?
No, not even this letter that came out this week, which we were talking about earlier on, that hundreds of environmental organizations signed, asking the Biden administration to stay away from nuclear and from carbon capture and storage and natural gas, saying that they only want 100% renewable, meaning solar, wind, and geothermal, not even hydro.
Wow.
By 2030. But then later in the document, they actually make the distinction between existing and new nuclear. So there seems to be like some sort of, realization that without existing fleet, we won't be able to decarbonize, at least in the near future.
I kind of interpret that differently, in that they're saying get rid of the old nuclear, but we're open to stuff that doesn't yet exist yet. And we're kind of, to sound reasonable, we're throwing you a bone that it's not just that we're anti-nuclear on principle. Maybe there's some flashy new technology, or, they're generally open to things like fusion or stuff that's highly theoretical, that hasn't been tainted with all of the complexities that come with actually bringing something into the world. But yeah, no, it's a very bizarre letter.
Yes.
So you said again, like, cause you went around to a variety of different, even kind of nuclear advocates. And I think a lot of those folks as well said, it's a done deal. Don't waste your time with this. As a fellow champion of potentially lost causes, I want to explore it. Like, there's a stubbornness to you, right? And I think that's interesting. So tell me a little bit more about that.
Pretty much everyone told me to not waste my time, and it was a done deal, and a lot of people have died on this hill. Don't, you're bringing something interesting to the table, focus on that.
Right.
I've always been I don't know, I've always cheered for the underdog. I think there is an element of me that wants to protect people who are being, or people or things in this case, that are being attacked for no reason. And Diablo is a perfect example of that. And this is completely off topic, but growing up, when I was maybe 5 or 6 old, 6 years old, I used to protect my classmates who were a little bit more nerdy, wore thick glasses. I had this one particular one that had a lisp, and he wore very, very thick glasses, and he was very skinny. And all the other boys used to beat him up and bully him. And I used to stand right in front of him and prevent the boys from beating him up. So there's always been that vein of wanting to protect and wanting to fix something that's wrong. And in this case, I can clearly see that this is just wrong, right? Especially in the context of climate change. This is just completely insane and wrong. And if, it's only a done deal if nobody does anything about it.
Totally. I can 100% identify with that. I also have to say, just as an aside, you really got to go to Isabelle's TikTok channel and see her boxing. It's pretty impressive. So I could see that she could send those bullies packing in the other direction. But yeah, that idea of, I think, I'm involved in a struggle to save one of our big nuclear plants here in Ontario, and it's a bit of a different situation. This plant would require refurbishment, which would be a big investment. It's not purely just a political closure, although we made a political choice to invest in the Germanization of Ontario rather than refurbishment, and it's going to mean that we're going to lose an enormous amount of power, and it's going to be replaced by gas. But when you tie a struggle, or I don't know, like if you just speak broadly about nuclear advocacy, it's kind of interesting. But when you tie to something that's real world and that really matters, and that's just such an illustration of what's gone wrong with the environmental movement, that's such a common sense thing to be advocating for. And literally, New York's fossil fuel use has gone up through the roof with the closure of Indian Point.
Right.
Like, that is demonstrably the wrong direction. And the discourse is so heated and it's so clear. I mean, the directives that we get from people like Greta Thunberg are so clear, and yet moving in the wrong direction on this is just, sorry about the beeps, guys. It's so unforgivable. And so even if it's a lost cause, I feel like that's the place to make the last stand or the pitch, or to really sell the advantages of nuclear, because it's there where it's demonstrated what a difference it's made, right? It's not even theoretical that this could lower emissions. It has. It's just, our Pickering plant was built instead of a 4 gigawatt coal plant, and the number of people that would have been killed from air pollution in the last 40, 50 years is insane. And so it's already got, spared us so much carbon. And if we extended it, would maintain Ontario as a world leader in low carbon electricity. And in California, it's going to be replaced by gas.
And not only that, Diablo could actually, if it wasn't enough that it provides a ton of clean electricity, it could also be converted into a hydrogen production facility, which, some people disagree about it, but a lot of folks in the energy community think that hydrogen will play a big role in the future of energy.
Yeah.
It could also be converted into a desalination plant, which California, and I didn't know this until I learned this about Diablo, but California has a huge issue around water. So if the plant was converted to a desalination plant, it would provide something crazy like 20% of the state's water needs.
Wow.
And all while still being connected to the grid. So in the case in the case that, there is a lack of electricity and the grid needs some support, it could kick right back in and help to give that support. So it truly is the most insane thing in the entire world to shut this plant down purely for ideological reasons.
I remember 4 or 5 years ago, or maybe it was a bit longer, maybe it was 10 years ago, there was a really bad Californian drought and the reservoirs dried up and hydro capacity dropped massively. And, I think something that got you initially interested in energy and in nuclear was experiencing the California wildfires and the sky turning orange and seeing areas of your homeland burning as well. And it's just, yeah, the vital role of water in this and the uncertainty, like we take it for granted, we turn the tap on and it's there. I mean, climate change is desertifying California to a big degree, right? We're going to see big changes in terms of the climate systems and the local weather patterns. It seems like it'd be a very good thing to keep this as at least as an insurance policy that, like you said, is like dual or triple use potentially.
It is a no-brainer. In this case, it truly is a no-brainer. And that is why I have hope. And I think that a lot of people are starting to wake up and realize that it's like the lowest hanging fruit.
And again, there was an application for a license extension. The NRC work was going well. There's no major repairs that need to be done. The issue was basically a bunch of permits that were required from the state of California for water intake and things like that.
Exactly.
So it is in terms of the feasibility of saving it. I mean, it's political in terms of having to reverse this enormous kind of anti-nuclear sentiment within California and within California political leadership, but it's not technically impossible. Oh, oh my Lord.
You have to close down the TikTok.
Oh, it's, you know what? When my internet goes down, when my internet goes down, it's a good marker. If I'm having internet problems, it lets me know. I don't know what.
Yeah, you should just leave it there forever.
It's pretty great. I'm going to use it as the intro to this whole thing.
Yeah, so okay. there is no technical reason as to why the plant couldn't keep operating. The political issue is obviously super challenging because, as we touched on this podcast, there is a long history around this plant, and a lot of the biggest environmental organizations have vested interest in seeing it shut down. And to be honest, for Governor Newsom, it would be very hard politically to reverse this decision. But technically, it could be relicensed. As a matter of fact, you can apply for the license or relicense process a day before the reactor is supposed to be shut down. Wow. So we still have time to apply for the license. It's just a political issue at this point. And that's why I always highlight the need for people to speak up and, talk to their families and friends and call your politicians and apply that pressure, because without it, there is zero incentive for, people who are in charge to reverse this decision.
Well, I think that's also a really interesting phenomenon, like something that I'm seeing developing as the environmental case for nuclear energy develops. It starts as a few kind of visionaries that start to, I guess, come up with the core concepts and the arguments, and that spreads and more people start learning about it. And then we're into a stage of kind of movement building. And it's really unfortunate that movement building wasn't present 10 or 20 years ago. But we are where we are. And like I said, even if we lose the battle on this, the movement grows and we gain the skills and we learn how to politically lobby and we learn how to do phone banks or whatever it is that we're doing to try and influence our politicians. Because these green groups have an incredible head start. I mean, they also have, $100 million bank accounts in some cases. I don't know where that kind of support is going to come, but in terms of movement building, I think that's another reason why fighting for this lost cause, quote unquote, hopefully it's winnable. There is some suggestions coming from the Biden administration that they're seeing the value of the existing fleet. And I think really just seeing the futility of the inability of deep decarbonization without it. I'm not naive enough to think that, there's going to be a federal moratorium on plant closures like Diablo, but a guy can dream. Let's shift gears slightly though. Cause I think part of what's really fascinating about the Diablo Canyon or the Save Diablo Canyon story is that it's really like a woman-led movement.
Mm.
with yourself, Mothers for Nuclear, Paris Ortiz Wines. You know, it seems like the real heroes of this movement are women, and that's pretty cool, and not what one would expect. Can you go into that a little bit more?
Yeah, so it's one of the things I find very attractive about it as well. And this is, I probably have some sort of synesthesia because when I was little, I used to imagine that numbers had gender. And for some reason, I feel like Diablo Canyon is a female nuclear power plant.
Well, you've put
Uh,
you is it your lips and eyeballs that you put on it
yeah,
for
yes,
TikTok videos?
exactly.
Okay, yeah, you've
Yes,
personified it pretty well.
yes, exactly. But even beyond that, I mean, I think there are a lot of nuclear advocates now that are very outspoken that are women. So beyond, you know, the Mothers for Nuclear in Paris, we have Good Energy Collective women like Jessica and Susie and Rachel, and we also have Xeon. And it's just, I feel like there is a renaissance of just nuclear enthusiasts who are female and speaking up against the injustices of the past, be it shutting down existing plants or, you know, whatever has happened in Navajo Nation, which we talked about before. And that has been super inspiring to me. And it's something, you know, when we talk about Mothers for Nuclear, and I know you had Heather in your podcast. I mean, Heather has been fighting for this plant for ages, right? And she never gave up, even when it seems to be hopeless, even when everybody else has given up. And just, you know, witnessing her perseverance has been one of the most inspiring things. And she gives me hope, and she makes me want to keep fighting for it. And same with Paris, she does the stand up for nuclear all around the world. And these are all incredibly strong and inspiring women, and I'm so glad to be, you know, fighting alongside them.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm going to be talking to Maddie Szarwinski soon as
Mm.
well about the Illinois threatened closures in Byron and Dresden. So shout outs to Maddie.
Maddie as well. Maddie, sorry, you know I love you.
I'm sure there's a bunch where
There's a bunch more. It's just like
yeah.
those are the ones that came to mind. But yeah,
Shout
there's,
outs,
I
shout
mean,
outs to
Maddie.
Ida. Shout outs to Ida Rieshelm.
Yeah, shout outs to, oh, now I feel bad because I didn't mention every single shout out to Katie Mama, shout outs to Rita Barmal, shout outs to every single female nuclear advocate or engineer or scientist who, you know, has kept their just stick to their mission, and, you know, just put aside all the public perception around this technology, and decided to fight for it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You know, one issue just with Diablo Canyon existing where it does in California, I believe it's 200 kilometers south of Silicon Valley.
Mm.
The computer industry is an ever growing source for energy. I was having a bit of a depressing conversation with Francois Morin, who's the president or the director of the China division of the World Nuclear Association. He was saying, you know, I was having these ideas that, you know, because China's building out nuclear so quickly, maybe this was a real route to rapid decarbonization and a model for the world. And he was saying, you know what, with the upgrade to 5G in China, the equivalent energy of the current fleet could all just be consumed by that 5G. So, you know, Silicon Valley, I mean, even things like cryptocurrencies, right? These are really high energy. They draw a lot of energy. You know, there was another interesting anecdote. Mark P. Mills, who I had on the podcast a while ago, he was talking about how, you know, it's pretty predictable when you think about energy needs of food, for instance. Like the difference between a starvation and a glutton diet is, you know, a couple thousand calories. For our material objects, it's also fairly finite. We always seem to want more creature comforts, but, you know, it's you can sort of guess at that. But for computing, for processing of information, really the sky's the limit. And with, you know, artificial intelligence, with you know, neural networks,
quantum computers.
Yeah, it's not like they run a calculation, stop and take a break. They just keep going, right? And that's led to some miracles, right? Like I remember getting my COVID vaccine, and I was very lucky as a healthcare worker to get it pretty early on back in January. And I mean, I was crying just that humanity had come together and developed this incredibly powerful pandemic ending tool in what, like 9 months? It was absolutely wild, but that was of course made possible by a lot of computing and a lot of energy use. So getting back to Silicon Valley, it has been promising to see companies like Google and Apple, and I'm guessing probably Microsoft, if Bill Gates still has influence there, moving beyond pledges and very creative accounting, shall we say, charitably, around 100% renewable commitments, where from what I understand, they're basically paying everyone else to use the dirty stuff so that they can claim that they're using the clean stuff.
Right.
But there's a move and a recognition that, hey, our data centers run 24/7. And so we need to power them 24/7. And to be credible, we need to be actually showing that we're using clean power 24/7. And so they've opened the door to nuclear energy. And really, it's interesting. I was reading through one of the Google reports, and they were really saying only kind of new or advanced nuclear. They did not make a single mention of existing nuclear. But here you have Silicon Valley, 200 miles to the north of Diablo Canyon, which is putting out 2,240 megawatts electric, 10% of California's energy. And it's just like, I don't know if you're connected or if you've talked to anyone in the tech community about this, but to me, this is just such a flagrant example of this is something they should have a big interest in if they want to say that their commitments to clean energy are more than virtue signaling.
Yeah, I've talked to a lot of people actually about it. What we have to do is facilitate that connection, right? Because right now, these companies are not going to go straight to PG&E and try to buy electricity from Diablo. So what we need to build, and this is something that I believe some people are working on, is a retail company that sells nuclear energy to other companies. So we know that renewables have that. A lot of companies just sell this credits, renewable credits. And we need to have something like that for nuclear power as well. So we can come to these companies and actually offer them a solution and say, here, you can buy,
that will by necessity be existing nuclear, right?
Exactly. Yes, because it's already there. So you'd have like a power purchase agreement or something like that.
And this exists, I think, I'm not sure if it's the only place in the world, but in Sweden, John Alberg, who recommended I talk to you a year ago, runs Kernfull Energy, which does I'm not sure, I'm not hot on the economics, but a tariff-based system where you can pay an extra cent or something and source your electricity in a somewhat imaginary way, but at least kind of show your support for the technology.
Yes, he does that. Of course, there are other people who do it around the world. Nobody has done it in the US. I don't think it's impossible. I think it's just a matter of someone who has the expertise and honestly wants to spend their time doing this, just stepping up. But I think this is one of the most important things in terms of saving the fleet. We need to find customers basically for this electricity, and setting up this company would be the easiest way to do that.
And I think really the tech community needs a signal from their consumers. Like, I really don't like kind of consumer-based activism, but there's a role for it. And I think like they're very tentative in their language. Like I quote you here, Google plans to run its entire global business fleet with 24-hour zero carbon energy by 2030 in what it calls its biggest sustainability moonshot. It's going to tap on wind and solar and look to new technologies such as green hydrogen and, drumroll, even nuclear, right? So they're so hesitant to say it. And I mean, when I read Bill Gates, How to Avoid a Climate Catastrophe as well, I mean, it's because of the audience they're talking to, which they assume is so nuclear phobic. I think it's the environmental groups that have done such a good job of holding the megaphone, and they have $100 million budgets, which are amplifying their message, that it's kind of terrifying politicians, because when you actually do surveys in areas like, especially in Ontario, for instance, there's really broad support for nuclear energy. And I think there's a real issue of perception, but I hope that's something that can be shifted. But if the commitment is just to say stuff that doesn't yet exist, or new technologies, or SMRs, for instance, I just did the very basic calculation. The only new nuclear, which would be an SMR using actually old pressurized water technology, is NuScale. And even with they've actually increased the power output of their units, but it would take 29 NuScale reactors to replace Diablo Canyon. Right? And how long would those take to build? First of a kind technology, world's biggest swimming pool to site the reactors in. And with the urgency of climate change, and I mean, the business community saying get to zero carbon by 2030, like allowing Diablo Canyon to go down is again, a climate crime.
It really,
I try not to be like too editorial on the podcast, but these things just piss me off so much that I can't be, you can't be neutral on a moving train.
it makes no sense. And like you said, data centers need electricity 24/7. And right now, we also have geothermal in California, but it's such a small percentage of electricity. So right now, the biggest source of clean, reliable electricity that's on 24/7 is Diablo Canyon. That is it. It's sitting right in front of everyone in Silicon Valley.
Right.
So absolutely. But again, these companies also don't have the time to go looking for it. If somebody comes to them with an offer
right.
to buy the power from Diablo Canyon, I'm sure they would consider.
Wasn't Diablo Canyon almost trying to give their power away for free to a San Francisco Bay group, and
yes,
it was
they declined.
refused?
It was refused. Yeah, something like that. I mean, people don't like nuclear, especially in California.
Yeah. No, I mean, the other thing I heard is that because of the grid stability that's already existing, because of the mix that California has invested in, and the closure of the San Onofre, the second California nuclear plant. That because of that grid instability, these companies that need reliable energy have been quietly siting massive diesel generators on site. It's interesting. The hospital I worked at, there was some workers doing some road work, and they dug up the two huge electric lines that bring electricity to our hospital. So our hospital almost went down. And they had to move this enormous diesel generator in to power like a 500-bed hospital. It was wild. We were quite anxious for some time. We have a small backup and had some batteries and things, but it was looking iffy. It's kind of like when your main source goes down and you're depending on the backup, and there's no backup for the backup, and people are on ventilators and on dialysis, and just you're doing a surgery and the lights go, like it's just terrifying to think about. But interesting to hear that these diesel generators are really making an appearance. And in the context I heard about in Texas, I mean, the economic damage from their blackouts were extraordinary. I think it was priced at $200 billion.
Right.
I think 60 billion has been spent on wind in the last 5 or 10 years there. But imagine what you could do with $20 billion. Like how many Diablo Canyons you could build.
How much?
200 billion was what I heard. I haven't gone and checked the source on that, but
I mean, to be fair, in the United States, it would probably be able to build like 10.
Well, that's all we need is 10 Diablo Canyons,
yeah, that's true.
And we've got all of California's electricity locked down, and maybe some desal as well. Anyway, I try not to stand too much here. I think this might be a good place to wrap up. I like not to go too long, but I'm not going to commit the cardinal sin of letting it go kind of 9, 10, 11 months without chatting to you again, Isabelle, because there's a lot more to touch on. Do you have any closing thoughts?
No, thank you for having me, and just sharing the story of Diablo, and just sharing your passion for it as well. And anyone who's listening to this and felt like they want to help, if you follow me on Twitter, reach out. And yeah, just like I said, just make sure you're talking to your politicians. You're actually making it clear that you don't want this plant to be shut down, telling your friends, telling your family about it, and maybe sending this podcast so they can listen to it and not be scared. And, maybe they'll calm down their fears a little bit.
And beyond Twitter, go to TikTok as well. I hadn't actually gone to Isabelle's TikTok yet. There's a bunch of content that's hard to find on Twitter that's very available there. And I'm not sure if that petition's still live, but you had some really funny videos for the petition. Thank you very much. Always a pleasure to chat.
Thanks, Chris.
All right. Bye for now.
Bye.
If you enjoyed the podcast, please make sure to subscribe, like, and review us on your podcast platform of choice. Until next time, guys.